On the night of the 26th of April, 2013, a security camera belonging to a business roughly a mile from a gas station in Norton Shores, Michigan, captured a silver minivan passing by at 11:04 in the evening. Investigators would later determine that within minutes of that van passing, a 25-year-old mother working the overnight shift alone at that gas station vanished. Her car was still in the lot. Her purse, with cash inside, was untouched. Drops of her blood were on the pavement outside. It would take 3.5 years, a 75-member task force, 12,000 investigative hours, and an unrelated crime committed against a different victim entirely before anyone was ever charged. This is the Jessica Heeringa case. Before we go further, if this is your first time watching one of our videos, welcome to Crime Lore. If you want to see more documented, fact-checked missing persons and unexplained disappearance cases like this one, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button, along with the notification bell, so you don't miss a new case when we post. And if you find this kind of deep dive investigation valuable, a like on this video genuinely helps us keep making them. Now, let's get into the full case. This is Crime Lore. Every episode, we build a complete, documented account of a missing persons or unexplained disappearance case using police reports, court records, and verified news coverage only. No dramatization, no invented dialogue, and no speculation beyond what investigators themselves have stated publicly on the record. Today, we are spending the full hour on a single case, the 2013 disappearance of Jessica Lynn Heeringa from Norton Shores, Michigan, and the investigation that would eventually connect her case to a second homicide and a task force spanning 15 separate law enforcement agencies. Jessica Lynn Heeringa was born on the 16th of July, 1987. By 2013, she was 25 years old. She was a mother, and by all accounts from those who knew her, a devoted one, working an overnight shift specifically because it allowed her to structure her days around her child's schedule. She was employed as a clerk at an Exxon gas station in Norton Shores, a small community along Michigan's western coast near Muskegon, sitting close to the Lake Michigan shoreline. Working an overnight shift alone at a 24-hour gas station is, by the nature of the job, an isolated position. Heeringa's station did not have interior surveillance cameras, a gap in coverage that would become one of the defining obstacles of the entire investigation that followed, because it meant that whatever happened inside or immediately around that store on the night of the 26th of April, 2013, would have to be reconstructed entirely from physical evidence, from the accounts of anyone who happened to be nearby, and eventually, years later, from digital records never intended to be seen by investigators at all. To understand why this case took as long as it did to solve, it helps to understand what investigators were and were not working with in the earliest hours. There was no video of an abduction. There was no eyewitness who saw the moment Heeringa disappeared. What there was a scene, a business, apparently abandoned mid-shift, with specific physical evidence left behind that told investigators a great deal about what did not happen, even before they could determine what did. On the night of the 26th of April, 2013, Heeringa was working alone, as was standard for the overnight shift at that location. At approximately 11:04 in the evening, a security camera belonging to a separate business roughly a mile away recorded a silver minivan passing through the area. Investigators would later determine this timestamp fell right around the point at which Heeringa disappeared, making that grainy, distant piece of footage one of the only visual records connected to the case for the next 3 years. At some point after that, a customer arrived at the gas station and found no attendant present. Recognizing that this was unusual for a staffed overnight location, the customer contacted authorities. When officers responded, what they found told them immediately that something was wrong. Heeringa's own personal car was still parked at the station. Her jacket was left behind. Her cigarettes were left behind. Her purse was recovered with a substantial amount of cash still inside it, untouched. In almost any other context, a missing employee with their belongings still on site might suggest a person who simply walked away, whether voluntarily or as the result of some personal crisis. But investigators do not evaluate a scene item by item in isolation. They evaluate the full pattern, and the pattern here included something far more specific. Drops of blood on the pavement immediately outside the station, later confirmed through DNA analysis to be Heeringa's own, and disassembled parts from a firearm recovered nearby. That combination, untouched cash, ruling out robbery as a primary motive, blood evidence indicating physical injury at the scene, and a weapon component suggesting the presence of a firearm during whatever occurred, led investigators to treat this from virtually the first hours as a probable abduction, not a voluntary disappearance, and not a simple missing person case that might resolve itself within a day or two. That determination shaped everything that followed. It meant investigators did not wait the customary period sometimes applied to adult missing person cases before escalating resources. Michigan State Police, the Norton Shores Police Department, and eventually federal partners began coordinating a response within hours rather than days. In the days immediately following Heeringa's disappearance, investigators worked to build out a description of the person or persons who might have been present at the station that night. Witnesses in the surrounding area provided details that authorities used to release a composite sketch. A white man, believed to be in his 30s, approximately 6 feet tall, with a medium to heavy build, and sandy or blonde hair that one witness described as possibly streaked. He was last associated with a red or orange sweatshirt. And critically, he was connected to a silver minivan, which investigators at the time believed might be a 2005 Chrysler Town & Country or a similar model. It's worth pausing here to explain why a detail as seemingly minor as a vehicle description matters so much in a case like this. A silver minivan is, on its own, an almost comically common vehicle. There are tens of thousands of them registered in West Michigan alone. A composite sketch based on secondhand witness recollection, gathered under stressful and unexpected circumstances, is notoriously imprecise human memory for unfamiliar faces observed briefly. At night is one of the least reliable forms of evidence in criminal investigation, a point extensively documented in decades of eyewitness identification research. Investigators knew this. It's part of why, even with a sketch and a vehicle description in hand within the first week, the case did not move quickly toward an arrest. A general description narrows a population of possible suspects from millions to perhaps thousands. It does not, on its own, produce a name. Over the following 3.5 years, authorities assembled what would become one of the more extensive multi-agency task forces in recent West Michigan history. 75 members, drawn from 15 separate local, state, and federal agencies. This kind of structure is not something law enforcement stands up for every missing person case. It is reserved specifically for cases where foul play is strongly suspected, where the case has a realistic chance of connecting to other unsolved crimes, and where the scale of investigative work required exceeds what any single department, particularly a smaller municipal department like Norton Shores, could realistically sustain on its own. The Heeringa Task Force was organized into 14 specialized divisions. These included an aviation support division, used for both search operations and, later, potential surveillance work, a behavioral science division, staffed by profilers trained to analyze the pattern of the crime itself for clues about the type of individual likely responsible, a technical services division, which handled digital evidence, phone records, and surveillance footage analysis, and an intelligence analysis division, responsible for managing and cross-referencing the enormous volume of information the investigation would generate. Over the life of the task force, investigators logged approximately 12,000 cumulative investigative hours. They fielded more than 1,400 individual tips from members of the public, everything from people who thought they recognized the composite sketch, to people reporting suspicious silver minivans in their own neighborhoods, to individuals with no direct knowledge of the case, but a theory they wanted investigators to consider. None of it produced an arrest. Not for more than 3 years. This is one of the least dramatized, but most important, realities of investigating a case like this. Television often compresses investigations into a matter of days, built around a single dramatic breakthrough. In reality, cases like Heeringa's often involve years of methodical, largely unglamorous work, verifying alibis, eliminating persons of interest, cross-referencing tips against known offenders in the area, and waiting sometimes for a piece of forensic technology to mature, and sometimes, as happened here, for an entirely separate event to hand investigators the break they could not manufacture on their own. In May of 2016, more than 3 years after Heeringa disappeared, a 16-year-old girl in Muskegon County had an encounter that would ultimately unravel the entire case. A man approached her in a silver minivan and offered her a ride. She accepted, and got into the vehicle to use his phone. At that point, according to her account to police, the man began driving away from where she expected to go and produced a gun. She made the decision, in the moment, to jump from the moving vehicle. She survived, and she immediately reported the incident to police. It is worth sitting with how significant that moment was, and how easily the entire subsequent investigation might never have happened. If that teenager had not escaped, if she had not had the composure and the opportunity to get out of that vehicle, investigators believe the connection to Jessica Heeringa's case, and to a second homicide we'll discuss shortly, might never have been made. Her decision to report the incident immediately and to cooperate fully with the resulting investigation is a detail law enforcement officials have specifically credited as the turning point in a 3-year-old cold case. Investigators moved quickly. Using surveillance footage collected from businesses along the route the teenager described, they traced the movements of the silver minivan and identified its likely owner, Jeffrey Willis, a Muskegon County resident employed at a furniture factory. The teenager was shown a photo lineup and identified Willis as the man who had approached her. At that point, investigators obtained warrants and searched both Willis's van and his residence. What they found connected him not to one unsolved case, but potentially to 2. Inside the van, they recovered a handgun fitted with a laser sight. Critically, the battery cover for that laser sight matched a component investigators had recovered from the Heeringa gas station scene back in 2013, a piece of physical evidence that had been sitting in an evidence locker for 3 years, waiting for something to match it against. The search of Willis's property also recovered a portable hard drive. On it, investigators found a folder labeled with a short string of letters they interpreted as an abbreviation for the word victims. Inside that folder were 2 subfolders, each labeled with a different set of initials. One set of initials corresponded to Jessica Heeringa. The other, as we'll return to, corresponded to a second woman entirely. Digital evidence like this occupies a particular place in modern criminal investigation. Unlike a witness statement, which can be mistaken or influenced by memory, or even physical trace evidence, which can sometimes be explained by innocent contact, a personally created and privately stored file, organized and labeled by the person who created it, speaks to intent and knowledge in a way few other forms of evidence can. Investigators do not typically find such direct organizational evidence in an active homicide investigation. More often, digital evidence takes the form of location data, message content, or search history. A dedicated folder, privately labeled with victim initials and never intended to be seen by anyone else, is comparatively rare, and it became a central pillar of the prosecution's case once Willis was formally charged. Beyond the digital evidence, investigators also reconstructed Willis's connection to Heeringa herself. They determined he had been a regular customer at the gas station where she worked, meaning he would have had routine, unremarkable opportunities to observe her schedule and her habits without raising suspicion. His physical description, his build, his hair color was consistent with the composite sketch released back in 2013, and investigators learned that in the years following Heeringa's disappearance, Willis had discussed her case with coworkers on multiple occasions, at times offering his own theories about what might have happened to her behavior investigators would later characterize, in hindsight, as consistent with an offender inserting himself into the public conversation around a crime he had committed. In September of 2016, Jeffrey Willis was formally charged with Jessica Heeringa's kidnapping and murder. As the broader investigation continued, a second name entered the case, Willis's cousin, Kevin Bloom, who worked as a corrections officer at a state prison facility. Bloom told investigators he had assisted Willis in burying Heeringa's remains near an old set of railroad tracks in Muskegon County. Acting on that information, investigators, along with cadaver dogs specifically trained to detect the scent associated with human decomposition, conducted extensive searches of that area. No remains were recovered. Bloom subsequently recanted parts of his statement during further questioning. Given the inconsistencies in his account and the absence of physical corroboration, prosecutors ultimately did not charge him as a participant in the murder itself. Instead, he was charged as an accessory after the fact, reflecting his role in allegedly helping to conceal evidence rather than in causing Heeringa's death. He was convicted on that charge and sentenced to time served, calculated at 476 days he had already spent in custody, along with 5 years of probation. We mentioned a second set of initials found in the victims folder on Willis's hard drive. That second name was Rebecca Blech. A 36-year-old Muskegon County woman who had been shot and killed while jogging along a rural road in Dalton Township in June of 2014, roughly 14 months after Heeringa's disappearance, and 2 years before Willis's arrest in the Nygaard case, finally connected all three incidents. Bletch's case had, until that point, been treated as an entirely separate, unsolved homicide. It was only through the digital evidence recovered from Willis's hard drive and the physical evidence recovered from his van that investigators were able to connect her death to the same person responsible for Heeringa's disappearance. Willis was charged separately in the Bletch case, and that prosecution moved to trial first. In November of 2017, a jury convicted Jeffrey Willis of first-degree murder in Rebecca Bletch's death. He received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole for that conviction. Willis's trial for Heeringa's murder followed roughly 6 months later, in May of 2018, and lasted 6 days. This trial presented a distinct legal challenge that the Bletch case had not. There was no body. Jessica Heeringa's remains had never been recovered, meaning prosecutors could not rely on forensic evidence directly connecting Willis to her physical remains, cause of death findings from an autopsy, or many of the other forms of proof typically central to a murder prosecution. Instead, prosecutors built their case entirely on circumstantial evidence, and a substantial volume of it. Over the course of the trial, they presented approximately 201 individual pieces of circumstantial evidence: the matching laser sight battery cover, the victim's folder, and its labeled subfolder. Willis's documented pattern as a customer at the gas station, his physical resemblance to the composite sketch, witness testimony regarding his behavior and comments about the case in the years following Heeringa's disappearance, and the broader pattern established by his conviction in the Bletch case. It's worth taking a moment here to explain what circumstantial evidence actually means in a legal context, because it is often misunderstood. Circumstantial evidence does not mean weak evidence or lesser evidence. It means evidence that requires an inference to connect it to a fact at issue, as opposed to direct evidence like an eyewitness to the crime itself, or a confession which requires no such inference. A single piece of circumstantial evidence can, on its own, mean relatively little. But when a jury is presented with 201 separate pieces, each independently supporting the same conclusion, and each requiring the defense to offer an innocent explanation, the cumulative weight of that evidence can become extremely difficult to overcome. Willis's own defense attorney told reporters after the trial that in his career, he had never handled a case built on that volume of circumstantial evidence, describing the central challenge as one of sheer quantity rather than any single decisive piece of proof he could focus his defense against. On the 16th of May, 2018, the Muskegon County jury reached its verdict after approximately 90 minutes of deliberation, a remarkably short deliberation period for a 6-day trial involving that volume of evidence, which prosecutors and observers alike took as an indication of just how comprehensively the case had been built. The jury found Jeffrey Willis guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping in Jessica Heeringa's case. He was sentenced the following month to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the mandatory sentence under Michigan law for a first-degree murder conviction. Combined with his earlier conviction in the Bletch case, Willis is now serving 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The criminal case is considered legally resolved. Jeffrey Willis has been convicted, sentenced, and is currently incarcerated. But for Jessica Heeringa's family, resolution in a courtroom is not the same as resolution in the fullest sense, because Jessica herself has never been found. Despite the searches near the railroad tracks based on Kevin Bloom's initial statement, and despite years of investigative work since, her remains have never been recovered. Retired lead investigator Michael Kasher, who worked the case for years before retiring, has spoken publicly about where he now believes Heeringa's remains are most likely located. Drawing on cell phone tower data that placed Willis's phone traveling into a specific area roughly 2 days after Heeringa's disappearance, Kasher has stated he believes her remains may be in a remote section of the Manistee National Forest, near the county line between Lake and Mason counties, an area roughly a 90-minute drive from Norton Shores. No search of that specific area has yet confirmed this theory, and it remains, in Kasher's own characterization, an educated hypothesis rather than a confirmed location. Heeringa's family has stated publicly that they continue to hold out hope she will eventually be found and brought home, allowing them the kind of closure that a conviction alone cannot fully provide. Her case remains formally open with respect to locating her remains, even though the criminal prosecution against the person responsible has concluded. Before we close, it's worth stepping back and considering what the Heeringa case demonstrates about how these investigations actually work, because it is, in many ways, a case study in several recurring elements of modern missing person and cold case investigation. First, it shows the critical role that seemingly unrelated events can play in resolving a case that has gone cold. Investigators did not solve Heeringa's disappearance through a breakthrough in her own case file. They solved it because a 16-year-old girl, in an entirely separate incident 3 years later, survived an encounter with the same individual and had the composure to report it immediately. Second, it illustrates how physical evidence collected at a scene, even when it cannot immediately be matched to a suspect, retains its value indefinitely. The laser sight battery cover, recovered from the Heeringa scene in 2013, sat in evidence storage for 3 years before it became one of the case's most important pieces of proof once investigators finally had a suspect and a weapon to compare it against. Third, it shows how digital evidence has changed the landscape of criminal investigation. A privately labeled folder on a personal hard drive, never intended for anyone else to see, provided prosecutors with some of their most persuasive evidence of premeditated intent and organized criminal behavior spanning multiple victims. And finally, it illustrates the particular difficulty of prosecuting a case without a body, a challenge that required Muskegon County prosecutors to build an entire circumstantial case, methodically, piece by piece. In order to secure a conviction despite the absence of the most direct form of evidence, a homicide prosecution typically relies on. Norton Shores sits along Michigan's western Lake Michigan shoreline, part of the greater Muskegon area, a region defined by small, closely connected communities where a case like this does not stay contained to a single police blotter. In the days and weeks after Heeringa's disappearance, local volunteers organized alongside law enforcement to distribute flyers throughout Muskegon County, and local media outlets, WOOD-TV, WZZM, and the Muskegon Chronicle among them provided sustained coverage that kept the case in public view long after the initial wave of attention faded. That sustained local coverage matters more than it might seem. Cold cases are, in a very real sense, dependent on the public, remembering to keep looking, keep talking, and keep calling in tips, even years after a disappearance, because it is often that ongoing public attention that eventually produces the piece of information that breaks a case open, as it ultimately did here, indirectly, through the report made by a 16-year-old girl who had no direct connection to Heeringa's case at all, but whose willingness to come forward gave investigators the thread they needed to pull. National outlets also picked up the story at points during its long arc. The case was profiled on an episode of the true crime program Crime Watch Daily, and later became the subject of episodes on multiple true crime podcasts, before ABC News's program 2020 produced a dedicated episode in February of 2024, examining all 3 of Jeffrey Willis's known cases together. That kind of sustained, multi-platform attention over more than a decade reflects both the scale of the investigation and the enduring public interest in cases where a person disappears without a body ever being recovered. It's worth examining more closely why, despite a 75-member task force and 12,000 cumulative investigative hours, this case did not produce an arrest for more than 3 years. Cold case investigators and criminologists who study long-running missing person cases generally point to a handful of recurring obstacles, several of which applied directly here. The first is the absence of direct video evidence. Because the gas station itself had no interior cameras, investigators were working from a single, distant, and low-resolution image of a vehicle passing a different business roughly a mile away. That kind of evidence can confirm a general time frame and a general vehicle type, but it cannot identify a driver, a license plate, or in most cases even a definitive vehicle model. The second is the sheer number of vehicles matching a general description. A silver minivan is one of the most common vehicle types on American roads, and in a region like West Michigan, investigators would have had to work through an enormous pool of registered owners before ever narrowing their focus to a specific individual, assuming they had any reliable way to narrow that pool at all without a more specific lead. The third, and in many ways the most significant, is that Jeffrey Willis had no criminal record that would have placed him on investigators' radar as a likely suspect during the initial 2013 investigation. He was, by all outward appearances, an ordinary community member, employed, unremarkable in his public interactions, and specifically noted by his own co-workers as someone who discussed Heeringa's case with apparent casual interest rather than any visible sign of involvement. Investigators cannot practically investigate every regular customer of a gas station as a suspect. There would have been dozens, if not hundreds, of men matching a broad physical description who had legitimate, innocent reasons to have been in and around that station in the weeks before Heeringa's disappearance. What ultimately changed the equation was not a break in the original case file at all, but an entirely new criminal act, Willis's May 2016 attempt to abduct a 16-year-old girl that gave investigators their first direct physical connection between a named individual and a vehicle, matching the one sought since 2013. This is a pattern that appears again and again in cold case resolution nationally. An offender who has not been definitively linked to an earlier crime often continues offending, and it is frequently that continuation, rather than any renewed effort on the original case, that ultimately provides investigators with the evidence needed to close it. It is difficult to overstate how central the account of the 16-year-old survivor was to the eventual resolution of both the Heeringa and Blech cases. Her decision to jump from a moving vehicle to escape an armed abductor required an extraordinary level of composure under an objectively life-threatening situation. Her subsequent decision to report the incident immediately, to cooperate fully with a photo lineup identification, and to provide investigators with a detailed and consistent account of the vehicle and the route taken, gave law enforcement the specific, actionable information that 3.5 years of general tips and composite sketches had not produced. Law enforcement officials involved in the case have publicly credited her actions as the turning point that connected 3 separate cases: her own attempted abduction, Heeringa's 2013 disappearance, and Blech's 2014 murder, to a single individual. Without her escape and her report, investigators have indicated they believe Willis may well have continued to evade identification indefinitely, given how few direct connections existed between him and either of his 2 adult victims prior to that moment. Throughout this case, and in many of the cases we cover on this channel, you will hear reference to cadaver dogs, sometimes called human remains detection dogs. It's worth briefly explaining what that actually involves, since the term comes up so often in missing person investigations. These are dogs trained specifically to detect volatile organic compounds associated with human decomposition, a scent profile distinct from that of other organic decay. Unlike a tracking dog, which follows a specific individual's scent trail, a cadaver dog is trained to alert on the general presence of human remains or decomposition residue, even after remains have been removed, and even in cases where remains are buried, submerged, or otherwise not visible on the surface. In the Heeringa investigation, cadaver dogs were used during the search of the area near the railroad tracks, identified by Kevin Blum, based on his initial account of helping to bury Heeringa's remains. That search did not recover remains, which does not necessarily mean the account was entirely false. Burial location descriptions given secondhand, sometimes years after the fact, are frequently imprecise, and searches of large wooded or overgrown areas can fail to locate remains that have shifted, been disturbed by animals or erosion, or were simply buried in a slightly different location than described. It is one of the reasons Jessica Heeringa's case, even after Willis's conviction, remains open with respect to actually locating her. We touched earlier on what circumstantial evidence means as a legal concept, but it's worth walking through, at a slightly deeper level, how prosecutors actually assemble 201 individual pieces of it into a single, coherent case a jury can follow across 6 days of testimony. Prosecutors do not simply present evidence in a random order and hope a jury connects the dots. They typically build a circumstantial case in layers, first establishing opportunity, meaning proof the defendant could plausibly have been at the relevant location at the relevant time, then establishing means, meaning proof the defendant had access to whatever was used to commit the offense, then establishing a pattern of behavior or motive that a jury can use to understand why the defendant might have acted as alleged, and finally, closing the loop with any physical or digital evidence that directly ties the defendant to the victim or the crime scene itself. In the Heeringa case, that structure is visible in how the evidence was assembled. Opportunity was established through Willis's documented status as a regular customer at the gas station, giving him routine, unremarkable access to Heeringa and her schedule. Means was established through the vehicle, matching witness descriptions and the firearm recovered from his van. Pattern and motive were established through the parallel Blech case and the broader forensic and behavioral profile investigators built around him. And the connective tissue tying it all together was the physical match between the laser sight battery cover recovered at the scene in 2013 and the weapon recovered from his van in 2016, along with the digital folder found on his hard drive. It was the combination of all four layers, rather than any single element in isolation, that gave prosecutors a case strong enough to secure a conviction without a body, historically one of the most difficult outcomes to achieve in American criminal prosecution. Because Rebecca Blech's murder became so directly intertwined with Jessica Heeringa's case through Jeffrey Willis's eventual conviction in both, it's worth giving her own case its own dedicated space here, rather than treating it only as a footnote to Heeringa's story. On the 29th of June, 2014, 36-year-old Rebecca Blech was jogging along a rural road in Dalton Township, Michigan. Not far from her own home, she was found dead of multiple gunshot wounds to the head. Neighbors discovered her body, along with several of her personal belongings, a sports armband, her cell phone, and her headphones and sunglasses, gathered in a small, deliberate pile on one side of the road, while a single spent shell casing was recovered from roughly the middle of the road itself. Investigators at the time described the scene as unusual and difficult to immediately interpret, and for nearly 2 years, the case remained unsolved, run in parallel to, but seemingly unconnected from, the ongoing Heeringa investigation happening in a neighboring jurisdiction. It was only after Willis's arrest in the Madison Nygaard attempted abduction case in 2016 that investigators connected him to Blech's murder as well. The shell casing recovered from the road in Dalton Township was matched to a gun found inside Willis's minivan. His computer's victims folder, which contained the subfolder connected to Heeringa, also contained a second subfolder labeled with initials matching Blech's name. Willis's trial for Blech's murder began with jury selection in October of 2017. On the 2nd of November, 2017, a jury found him guilty of first-degree murder and of using a firearm in the commission of a felony. He was sentenced roughly 6 weeks later, in mid-December of 2017, to the mandatory term of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Blech's sister later spoke publicly about the case, describing the loss as a pain she said would never fully go away. Unlike Heeringa's case, Blech's remains were recovered at the scene on the day she was found, meaning her family, unlike Heeringa's, did not face the additional, ongoing uncertainty of an unrecovered body once Willis was convicted. Taken together, the two cases investigated for years by different teams in different jurisdictions, without any confirmed connection between them, were ultimately resolved as a single body of evidence once Willis's identity became known. It is a pattern investigators have specifically pointed to as a caution against treating unsolved cases in neighboring jurisdictions as necessarily unrelated, even when there is no obvious link between them at the outset. A case of this scope inevitably leaves open questions, some of which investigators have addressed directly, and some of which remain genuinely unresolved. Is Jeffrey Willis responsible for other unsolved cases in the region? Investigators have not publicly confirmed any additional victims beyond Heeringa, Blech, and the attempted abduction of Madison Nygaard. However, given the apparent premeditation reflected in his digital record-keeping and the specialized equipment recovered from his van, some retired investigators who have studied the case have raised the question of whether other unsolved disappearances or assaults in the broader West Michigan region during the years Willis was active might eventually be connected to him, though as of this recording, no formal reopening of any additional case has been publicly announced in connection with Willis. Specifically, will Jessica Heeringa's remains ever be recovered? This remains genuinely uncertain. Cases where a conviction has been secured without a body sometimes see remains recovered years or even decades later, occasionally as a result of environmental changes, construction activity, or renewed search efforts using updated technology such as ground-penetrating radar or improved cadaver dog training methods. In other cases, remains are never recovered at all. Retired investigator Michael Casher's continued public statements about his belief regarding the Manistee National Forest reflect an ongoing, if currently inactive, hope that new information or renewed search resources could eventually resolve this part of the case. Could Willis's convictions be overturned on appeal? As of this recording, Willis's convictions in both the Blech and Heeringa cases remain in place. Any defendant convicted of a serious felony in Michigan retains the right to pursue appellate review, and it is not uncommon for such appeals to continue for years after an initial conviction. This script will be updated in a future episode if either conviction is disturbed on appeal. Jessica Heeringa clocked in for an overnight shift on the 26th of April, 2013, and never clocked out. It took 3.5 years, a task force of 75 investigators across 15 agencies, and the courage of a teenage girl who survived an unrelated attack to finally connect her disappearance to the man responsible. Jeffrey Willis is now serving 2 life sentences without parole. Jessica Heeringa has still never been found. If this deep dive helped you understand the full scope of this investigation, do us a favor. Leave a like, let us know your thoughts in the comments, and if you haven't already, subscribe to Crime Lore and turn on notifications so you catch our next documented case the moment it goes up. Thank you for watching.